Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of Range of Science. Today our guest is Professor JohnJoe McFadden. He's known for he's professor of molecular genetics at Surrey University, and he's known for his work in quantum biology and his Cemi field theory of consciousness. Thank you very much for coming, Professor.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Zaza.
Let's start with historical overview of quantum biology. What were main insights by Schrödinger and Jordan Pascal that laid grounds for the field of quantum biology?
Yes, so quantum biology first emerged in the early part of the 20th century as an effort to really try to apply principles of physics that had been discovered in the early part of the 20th century by Niels Bohr, Albert Einstein, Erwin Schrödinger, to life. And at that time, it was still considered that life was something of a mystery. And there was a general feeling that perhaps it was a mystery that needed quantum mechanics. And that was a rather vague idea at the time, but then it was brought into sharper focus by scientists such as Erwin Schrödinger and Pascal Jordan. Pascal Jordan was probably the first, and he proposed that what made life susceptible, if you like, to quantum mechanical influences was that it involved small numbers of molecules. And if you involve small numbers of molecules, then you inevitably bump into quantum mechanical rules rather than the classical rules, such as thermodynamics, which depends on large numbers of molecules. Erwin Schrödinger took this idea further and applied it particularly to heredity. He was interested in the basis of heredity, and he worked out the size of a gene from basic principles. And on that, he estimated the number of particles that could be present in a gene, and from his estimate, and that number was relatively small, he concluded that life's rules, if you like, the regular behavior of life couldn't be accounted for by classical principles because there were very small numbers of particles available in genes, and with that small number, it would be subject to large stochastic variations. Any rule based on, or any classical rule based on small numbers of particles. But he then went on to propose that, at least for genes, that they have their stability and definiteness in terms of coding for a particular characteristic, because they're rooted in quantum mechanical at the quantum mechanical level. So just as the orbitals of atoms, the electronic orbitals, are very finely defined and very accurate, and they remain the same for millions of years. So heredity, he speculated, was based on some quantum mechanical system, something that he called a periodic crystal, something that has the permanence of a crystal but encodes information to make living creatures.
Would you mind explaining how the quantum mechanical notions of entanglement, quantum tunneling, and wave-particle duality are relevant to migration of European robin, functioning of enzymes, and photosynthesis, respectively? This must be some of the most well-established well-established phenomena where quantum level phenomena influence biological systems, as I understand.
Okay, so for many decades after Erwin Schrödinger wrote a quite popular book, What is Life?, in which he proposed that some aspects of life were based on quantum mechanics. The science of quantum biology went into a kind of doldrums. It was not really pursued as molecular biology really took over as a way of unraveling the mechanisms of life. And that worked for many decades until experiments really in the late 1990s and early 2000s started to uncover aspects of biology that seemed to could be only accounted for by quantum mechanics. And probably the first of these was enzyme action, actually, which enzymes are the workhorses of biology. They perform all the biochemical reactions that are involved in biological systems. They make every single biomolecule on the planet, so they're extremely important. And how they work has been somewhat mysterious. They're extremely efficient catalysts with that can increase the rate of a reaction by factors like as high as 10 to the 20, so 10 with 20 noughts on the end. And to put that kind of number in perspective, if you could increase your walking speed by that kind of factor, you could walk across the universe in seconds. So it's an extraordinary level of acceleration that enzymes deliver to chemical reactions. And how they do it is something of a mystery. And what was discovered in the 1970s, in fact, was that some enzymes, electron tunneling is involved in some enzymes. And tunneling is a quantum mechanical phenomenon, essentially where a particle disappears in one point of space and appears in another point in space without visiting any of the in-between parts, in the in-between places. And that was first discovered to be taking place in respiration by scientists in the 1970s. And then, even more surprising, in the 1990s, scientists such as Judith Klinman in the US and Nigel Scruton in the UK did experiments that demonstrated that protons can also tunnel, doing this trick of disappearing in one point of space and appearing in another point of space in the mechanisms of some enzymes. And this may explain really how enzymes, or at least partly explain how enzymes have their extraordinary efficiency. Essentially, tunneling is inefficient unless if you like, the starting point of a particle, the end point of a particle where it moves to are very close. Tunneling doesn't take place unless they're very close. Mm-hmm. There still may be a big energetic barrier between 2 points. And what enzymes do is bring substrates so close that particles like electrons and protons can tunnel from one position to another, again, disappearing from one position and appearing in another without visiting any of the in-between places. And this could be a large part of how enzymes work, and experiments demonstrated that for both electrons and protons that also tunnel in enzyme reactions. So that was one of the first demonstrations. Then in the early 21st century, experiments demonstrated that photosynthesis involves a phenomenon called quantum coherence. And this is where phenomenon whereby particles, quantum mechanical particles such as electrons and protons, can be in multiple places at the same time. They behave like waves, essentially. And this was applied to the puzzle in photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is obviously the most important biochemical reaction on the planet, because it makes all of the biomass. All the biomass in our bodies effectively comes from a plant. Plants make biomass by bringing together carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and other elements, plus sunlight, to turn it into sugars and trees and grass, and then all the animals and plants and other organisms feed on that biomass. So it's the most important reaction in the entire biosphere, the most important reaction in the entire universe, as far as we know, because it's the only example of life is here on our planet. And it depends on this reaction for making our planet so special. And there's a mystery. There's several mysteries about it. It's a very complicated reaction, but one of them is that the efficiency of the first step of photosynthesis And essentially, photosynthesis involves a pigment, chlorophyll, which captures a photon of light and then delivers it to a place called the reaction center, where the energy of the photon is converted into chemical energy. And that chemical energy then goes into fixing carbon dioxide and making sugars and other molecules. So that first step in the process, a photon of light is captured, and then the energy has to be transported to this place called the reaction center. And when you look at that classically, the transport involves a number of hops that should be quite efficient. And the problem with this process is that if it doesn't happen very fast, if the energy isn't captured very fast, then the energy will be lost as heat or phosphorescence, or fluorescence, sorry. So it was a puzzle that actually in photosynthesis, although the reaction ought to be inefficient, it's extraordinarily efficient. It's as close to 100% efficient as we can measure optimal conditions. So it was a puzzle to understand why it is so efficient. The energy should be lost between its capture point and its delivery point, but it isn't. And how it seems to be captured and delivered so efficiently, this energy transport reaction was shown by scientists such as Greg Engel in the US, when he shone laser light at the system and then analyzed the light that is kind of reflected out of photosynthetic systems when they perform this reaction. He found that the transport process between the capture of the light and its receipt in the reaction center seems to be wave-like rather than particle-like. The energy is transported from one place to another as a wave that goes in all directions. So it then can kind of find the most efficient route to be delivered to the reaction center, and that can account for at least part of the reason why that photosynthesis is so efficient. So that was another big area, another big revelation, that this so important reaction on our planet seems to involve this phenomenon of quantum coherence. So that's when particles behave like waves, we call it quantum coherence, and it's a feature of mechanics and only not classical systems. So that was the second big revelation. And the third involved, as you mentioned, the avian navigation. Experiments performed in the early part of this century demonstrated that, in fact, some in the last century as well, demonstrated that birds are able to navigate using a compass. They have some kind of compass, but it's a rather peculiar compass in that it uses light. It requires light, which is unlike a normal compass. I would call it a Boy Scout compass, which doesn't need light. It works in the dark, but the bird compass requires light. That's one odd feature. The second is that it points to the nearest pole, and it doesn't really care which pole it is. And to account for these features, also the general kind of question of how do you get a compass out of living flesh? How do you make living flesh sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field, which is an extraordinarily weak magnetic field? You have to, if you think about a compass needle, it's a very, very light needle that's pivoted on a very frictionless pivot in order to make it move and point north. How do you do that in a living organism? And why should it involve light? All of these were puzzles until Thurston Ritz, an American scientist, teamed up with the Wulchkos, a couple of ornithologists. And they did some experiments demonstrating that the features of the avian compass were even more peculiar, that the compass could be thrown off course, if you like, by radio waves. And this could only be accounted for if it was a compass that involves what is called the radical pair reaction. And this is a rather complicated concept, so I'll try and make it simple. But basically, in some chemical reactions, you form two types of molecules called radicals. And these are radicals which have single electrons. And single electrons, because they're electronic, because they have this property called spin, which is the kind of spin around, they're a moving charge. Moving charges generate magnetic fields. Now, in some chemical reactions, you generate pairs of magnetic fields. Pairs of free radicals. So you have pairs of free radicals that interact with each other. And they interact with each other magnetically. And that interaction is sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field. And they interact by this process of coherence and also possibly, although this isn't so clear, this feature of entanglement. And this is because the free radicals are also entangled. And then we have to explain what entangled is. Basically, entangled is a very odd phenomenon of quantum mechanics where two particles that interact can be pulled as far apart as you like to the ends of the universe. And if you put a pin in one, the other one will jump. This is the oddest feature of quantum mechanics, that objects that are removed to very great distances can still have a connection, such as when one of them is measured, the other one will, perturbed by, say, a measurement, the other one will respond in some way. And it's so mysterious that Einstein, who actually was the first person to show that this would happen, he didn't believe it. And he's the guy who gave us black holes and bending space-time, but he couldn't believe in entanglement, this feature of entanglement, that particles that are separated can still have a connection, irrespective of their distance. But despite his disbelief, experiments in the 1970s and 80s demonstrated that entanglement does exist. You can demonstrate entanglement with photons and other particles such as electrons, that they can be entangled, such as if you disturb one, the other one is affected by that disturbance, even though they're separated by very great distances. And to account for the avian navigation system, you needed these entangled radical pairs. And that entanglement is involved in their, if you like, communication, how they manage to communicate and detect the Earth's magnetic field. So this is the other big side of the other big interesting field. And this field is responsible, so this is thought to be responsible, and this is still a controversial area, thought to be responsible for avian navigation. But this radical pair system seems to be involved in many other features of biology. There are many features of biology that, such as development, seem to be affected by magnetic fields, wound healing also affected by magnetic fields. And the best guess is, although the mechanism isn't clear, that many other features of biology, which we know involve free radicals, may also have this sensitivity to magnetic fields through the radical pair mechanism that's found in birds and appears to account for the avian compass. So the radical pair mechanism seems to be diffusing, if you like, and finding possible roles in many other aspects of biology. I mentioned one other, and that is the one that me and Jim Al-Khalili got interested in first as a possible source of quantum biology, and that is mutation. Mutation may involve the motion of a proton in DNA, in the DNA chain. And it was proposed shortly after Watson and Crick had discovered the double helix and its structure, and that protons were involved in the coding properties of DNA. It was proposed that they may also be the source of mutation, that protons may tunnel from one place to another, if you like, from the correct position in the double helix to the wrong position in the double helix to cause a mutation. And that was proposed back in the 1950s, and we're still trying to investigate that. And this is what interested me and Jim Al-Khalili in quantum biology more than 20 years ago. And we're still pursuing to try to find evidence that quantum tunneling of protons is involved in mutation. And we think we have some some evidence in that direction at least. So there are many different avenues of quantum biology now. It's now stretched into areas such as vision, protein structure, and many other areas. How drugs work may involve quantum mechanics. So it's a big burgeoning and growing field of biology and physics.
Electromagnetic field has been largely dismissed as epiphenomenon, as having no causal influence on consciousness by many neurobiologists, but your theory says something different, that consciousness is information integrated in electromagnetic field. And I was wondering, what are some recent experimental support for the theory?
Yes, there's a great deal of support for the theory. So the theory is basically I came up with this theory when trying to discover a solution to what's called the binding problem in consciousness. And this is that if you, for example, when you see a visual scene, I can look out the window, I can see trees blowing in the wind, lots of different textures, colors, shapes, orientation of lines. All of these features are encoded in different parts of your brain. There's nowhere, if you look at the neurons of the brain, where those features come together to make a tree. Everything's dissected, and some of it, the colors of the leaves will be off in one part of the brain and their shape will be in another. You can still process that information to generate a response such as there's a tree out there. But it doesn't seem to make sense with our conscious experience where all of it comes together, all of the information is brought together in a single conscious percept of, say, a tree. And it's been a big puzzle. Where is that coming together of all of the information? And there's lots of theories to try to explain it, and none of them, I think, adequately account for it. But it occurred to me that there may be a very simple explanation. Every time a neuron fires, it involves the motion of ions. I mentioned before, motion of ions are electric charged, and any moving charge will generate a magnetic field, an electromagnetic field. This means that the brain, and that all of the neurons, the 100 billion neurons, when they're firing all the time, and you're looking at a tree or anything else, they're generating lots of, if you like, pulses of electromagnetic information into the brain. All of those pulses then kind of overlap and join up to become the brain's electromagnetic field, which is then detected by the techniques that we know about already. EEG, discovered over 100 years ago, that you can detect the brain's electrical field by putting electrodes on the skull. And it's a highly complex electrical structure, as you would expect, because it's generated by the firing of 100 billion neurons. And then the technique of MEG, magnetoencephalography, has been used to detect the magnetic field of the brain, which is also a highly complex structure that is highly dynamic. So we know that the brain has an electromagnetic field. What we know about fields is that they, by their nature, unify information. They are, if you describe an electromagnetic field quantum mechanically, you can describe it as a single equation, a single Schrodinger equation, which will describe all of the features of that field. It can be brought into a single equation. And that means that all of the information is unified in the brain's electromagnetic field. If you could kind of jump onto a photon in the electromagnetic field, it wouldn't matter which way you jumped, you'd meet the same information because the information is overlapping in all of the regions of the brain. And the total brain electromagnetic field has the same physical unity as, say, a single photon or a single electron. It's physically unified. So this is where all of the information in the brain comes together. So it occurred to me that that makes sense as a way of explaining the binding problem. That consciousness may simply be the brain's electromagnetic field. It's where all of the information comes together. And it occurred to me that there was several predictions of the theory. One is, because we know electromagnetic fields come in waves, like the waves of the sea. electromagnetic fields have this wave-like character. And that means that they have a property called interference. And that is, if the peak of one wave meets the trough of another wave, then they cancel each other out. So you get no wave. You can see this if you throw well, let's go on one more step. Secondly, if the peak of one wave meets the peak of another, then they reinforce each other. And these two features are called interference. One is called constructive interference, where the waves meet and they reinforce each other. And the other is destructive interference, where the peak of one meets the trough of another and they cancel each other out. These features of waves, we know they were first discovered for light. We know it happens in water. You throw two pebbles in a still pond and you can see where the waves overlap, and they sometimes, in some places, they'll form bigger waves. In other places, they'll cancel each other out. It's a feature of waves. If consciousness is a wave, then we would expect that there would be certain features of electromagnetic field information that will have wave-like character. For example, they should show interference. Now, if that's the case, then we would expect that if a number of neurons are firing asynchronously, so neurons can fire synchronously, in which they're firing at the same time, and if they're firing synchronously, then they will have constructive interference. So their amplitudes will multiply, will be additive really, rather than multiplicative. Then the net field will be much greater. If neurons fire asynchronously, then mostly they're going to cancel each other out. So that made a clear prediction about consciousness. For conscious information, the neurons have to fire synchronously. They have to be firing at the same time, firing in step. And that would then generate an electromagnetic field pulse, if you like, that goes off into the brain and becomes our conscious thoughts. So the prediction of that would be that conscious information we are conscious of, should be associated with neurons that are firing synchronously. That that prediction of the theory has been demonstrated in tens of thousands of experiments that show that synchronous firing of neurons is the best correlate we have for consciousness. So, for example, when you are not conscious of something, say I wear glasses, I often take them off, and then I can't find them. And I could be looking somewhere on my desk, and I don't see them, even though they're on my desk. And that means that if my glasses are on my desk, I'm looking at my desk, the information registering my glasses is entering my brain, but I'm not conscious of it. And then there comes a moment you say, ha, there they are. And you're staring at the same information, that same information that a moment ago you were unconscious of, your glasses, you're now conscious of. Now, there have been lots of experiments in many, many systems which look at then what is the difference between information that is unconscious in the brain, you're not conscious of, and information that then becomes conscious. And the difference is that when the information is, say, neurons that are reporting my glasses, when I'm not conscious of them, the neurons are firing asynchronously. When I become conscious of them, they fire at the same rates, the same neurons fire. The only thing that happens is they start firing synchronously. And then we become conscious of the information, because when they're firing synchronously, they fire the information off into the electromagnetic field and we become conscious of it. So that prediction of the theory is fully borne out by thousands of experiments. More recently, there's another prediction of the theory, which is very important, and that is that the information in the brain's electromagnetic field, which is our conscious mind, according to the theory, has to influence neurons. Because we talk about, I can talk about the tree, it's in my conscious mind and I can talk about it, which means that information has to influence neuron firing. So although there was evidence for that when I first proposed the theory about 20 years ago, the evidence was slim. But in the last decade or so, there's been lots of evidence for neurons being sensitive to weak electromagnetic fields, the kind of electromagnetic fields that the brain itself generates. So, for example, in Christoph Koch's laboratory in California, he demonstrated that very weak electromagnetic fields will change neuron firing patterns in brain slices. And Michael McCormack, working in another US laboratory, demonstrated similar findings for a completely different system, but again showing that weak electromagnetic fields influence neuron firing. So then you have a loop of information. So the neuron firing generates the electromagnetic field of the brain, that is our conscious mind. And now we can clearly say that there's strong evidence that that electromagnetic field information in our brain will push and pull on our neurons to actually make them fire or inhibit them from firing. So in other words, it has a causal influence on neural firing. And this, in the Cemi field theory, is, I believe, what our will is. What we call free will, it's the influence of the brain's electromagnetic field on neural firing to make us do things like lift my hand up at the moment, which I do consciously. Those conscious actions that we perform all the time, I'm doing that consciously, have been driven by the electromagnetic field in our brain. All the other stuff we do, like when I'm talking, although my hands are down here, often my hands are moving when I talk and I'm not conscious of them. Those kind of things are driven by our neuronal mind. And most of what the brain does is probably done through the wires of the brain, through the neurons, exactly as neurophysiologists believe the brain works. And this neuronal firing is certainly responsible for most of what happens in the brain. But that trickle of information which goes through our conscious mind and is responsible for our conscious thoughts and becomes the person we are, that, I claim, is actually the brain's electromagnetic field. It's generated by the brain neural firing, and it influences neural firing. And that is the loop of information that goes through our conscious mind.
What is the relationship of your theory to Stendahan's Global Neuronal Workspace model and the Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory? How your theory is related to?
Well, the theory is, if you like, it's a subset of integrated information theory. I proposed it back in 2000 that information in the brain is integrated in the brain's electromagnetic field. So several years before Tononi came up with his integrated information theory. So right from when I first described the theory in 2000 in the book Quantum Evolution, and then in subsequent papers I published in 2001 or 2002, I made the case for information being integrated in the brain's electromagnetic field. That's how it gets integrated. In Tononi's theory, he also proposes that consciousness is made of integrated information. But it still isn't clear to me how that information is integrated. As far as I can see in his papers, he proposes a kind of mathematical integration that happens in the brain through the connectivity. Some kind of connectivity which has certain properties means that this kind of information in these neurons gets integrated, whereas other information that doesn't have this level of connectivity doesn't become conscious. I can't really make sense of that, in that all of the brain is connected to every other neuron via some neuronal path. So actually just setting a set of neurons that you say is more or less connected than another, I don't think makes sense in the brain. Every neuron is connected to thousands of others, and through thousands of others, the entire brain. So everything is connected. So I don't think you can, and to me also, it doesn't explain how the information gets integrated. the semi-field theory tells you why the information in neurons becomes integrated, because when it's projected into the brain's EM field, then an electromagnetic field automatically integrates information. That's what we mean by electromagnetic field. And we're very familiar with this property because we use it to, well, when we had analog TV and radio, then all our TV signals and radio signals came through waves that you could pick up on mobile phones. You could take a mobile phone anywhere in a room and you can pick up exactly the information of download a movie, and someone else in the other side of the room can download a different movie. All of the information is everywhere. This is what electromagnetic fields do. They integrate electromagnetically encoded information. I don't see that happening in Tonelli's theory. I don't see where that information would be, or why that information would be integrated just because it has some level of neuronal connectivity. That level of neuronal connectivity, I can't see why it should integrate the information. It will still be stuck in one neuron and another neuron and another neuron over there. So I don't see how he gets physically integrated information out of his theory. And I've forgotten the other theory that you...
Stanislav Dehaen's Global Neuronal Workspace theory.
I think, well, if I understand that, that's rather like the Global Workspace theory, which proposes that some subset of the brain's information is a kind of workspace, which everything is pooled, and all the neurons can have access to this information and can pull information out and pool and drop information into this workspace. That's precisely how I believe the brain's electromagnetic field works. It is the global workspace of the brain. It's where conscious information is dropped into. It's where information is dropped into the electromagnetic field to be part of our conscious mind. And then it can jump out again when it's used by our willed actions. So the difference between my theory and other global workspace theories is I propose a physical mechanism for it, rather than just saying, well, this is some abstract a part of the brain or abstract collection of neurons where this happens. And that seems to be all of the global workspace theories are kind of theoretical. They are theories, but they don't propose a physical mechanism for how the information is pooled, how the pooled information then generates responses that generate our voluntary actions. It's kind of just theoretical that, yes, it happens. What my theory does is tells you how it happens, a physical mechanism for it. And this, to me, any theory that doesn't do that, that tries to explain consciousness without actually coming to the physicality of it in terms of talking about atoms, protons, electrons, photons, and exactly how it's working. It's no good to just say, well, the information is pooled. How is it pooled? This is, I think, what my theory provides, a physical mechanism which is lacking in nearly all other theories of consciousness. They're either vague, mathematical, like Tononi's, or then they just ignore the problem of the physicality of it and just talk about consciousness as an abstract term.
So your theory unifies aspects of both integrated information theory and global neuronal workspace, yeah?
Yes, exactly. That's through having a underpinning integrated information with a physical substrate, the brain's electromagnetic field, automatically brings in the global workspace theory, because again, this is what I proposed back in 2000, first of all, in 2002, that the brain's electromagnetic field integrates information. That's where the information of our conscious mind is integrated. And that also acts as a global workspace for all of the circuits of the brain to access, because as I described before, the great thing about the brain's EM field, it's everywhere. It's everywhere in the brain. So all of the brain has access to exactly the same information, just like everyone in your house will have access to the information coming from your router, which will allow them to download movies, talk, chat to people on Zoom or whatever else. That's available all everywhere around the room. So the EM field of the brain has that same function for the brain of being a pool of information simultaneously available to all of the neurons in the brain.
Conscious experience exists as experienced by animal or human. In other words, it has first-person perspective. It is first-person phenomena. But electromagnetic field and brain is third-person phenomenon. How does your theory explain this shift from subjective first-person to objective third-person point of view?
A very interesting question, and one which I've thought long and hard about. And I think the key thing to do when considering the Cemi field theory is that you've got to shift from that third person to a first person. You've got to say, okay, you're not now looking at the brain's electromagnetic field and looking down in it. You've got to shift to the frame, to the physical frame of the electromagnetic field in the brain. So instead of your frame being the neurons and thinking about the electromagnetic field as something external, you've now got to say, okay, what would it feel like if it was the brain's electromagnetic field? Now, if you once you do that, then strange things happen. And this is, you shift from this third person to this first person. Now you are the brain's electromagnetic field. So what do we get with that? You get all of the information in the brain is there. It's all there in a point, it's there in every infinitesimal point of the brain, and it's there throughout the entire brain. And it is you, and that becomes your first person perspective. And the weirdness of this, it's worthwhile thinking about. It is a big jump. For example, if you jump, and the consequences of this jump, I think are still not entirely clear to me. I'm saying that your consciousness is actually residing on photons. Photons are the particles of the electromagnetic field. Now, photons are very strange because they don't experience time. A photon that is released from, say, the surface of the sun may take several minutes to find its way into your eye, but from the photon's perspective, it takes zero time. It is released from an electron at the surface of the sun, and it appears in an electron. It is absorbed by an electron in your retina at the same moment in time. Remember that in Einstein's theory of special relativity, as you approach the speed of light, time stands still. So time freezes when you're at the speed of light. And at the speed of light, you can travel around the entire universe in a single moment of time. Now we have to say, okay, we are these photons, that are being emitted from one neuron and being picked up by another neuron. They don't experience time between the emission and the absorption of that photon. They also are delocalized because no photon is any different. The photon that is picked up here is not different from the photon picked up elsewhere. So it's a very strange, I'm still getting my mind around and my mind being electromagnetic field itself, I propose, it's thinking about itself and trying to work out, okay, what are the consequences for that? And I think they may have some consequences, for example, in thinking about the arrow of time. If we're photons, we don't really experience, if our mind or conscious mind is a photon, except essentially trillions of photons in an electromagnetic field, time is experienced differently because we're traveling at the speed of light. Our conscious mind is traveling at the speed of light between one neuron and another. And whether that gives you some different experience of time than everything else, I think is something that is intriguing, and I haven't quite got my head around it. But I think there are essentially, so go back to the original question, that third person to the first person is like when Einstein worked out his theory of special relativity, he imagined himself jumping on a photon and gliding around the universe and saying, okay, how would the universe look if you were doing this? I'm asking people when they're thinking about the semi-field theory to do the same. Jump on the photon in your brain. This is now your first person perspective. You are all of the information that your brain is generating and you're able to influence and is able to influence your actions. That is you. That's your first person perspective. You are information. You aren't someone absorbing information, looking at information. You are information. So consciousness then is information encoded in electromagnetic fields, in photons. That is you. And that's your first person perspective.
What is free will according to your theory?
Free will is the influence of the electromagnetic field on brain neurons. Now, then we have to, what do we mean by free will? Why is it free? And this is the idea that I think it's a very confusing term, free will. And I think the word has thrown philosophers off on a wrong track for hundreds of years. When we think about our willed actions, are they really free? If I choose to raise my hand, that's a free choice, you say, but actually not something that didn't have antecedent causes. I raised my hands because I was trying to make a point about free will, and that was the cause of it. The reason why I was trying to make a point about free will was because I'm having an interview with you, Zaza, and the cause of that is because you sent me an email a week or so ago. So we understand, if we think about our actions, that they aren't really free. They're caused by earlier actions, earlier things that happened. So I think this free part of will is confusing, and we should get rid of the term free will. It's just will. Mm-hmm. Free will was forced upon us really by religion. Religion has forced the idea of free will because it believes that, say in Christianity and many other religions such as Islam as well, we are free to make choices so God can punish us if we make the wrong choice. We're going to be free to do that. And it's really emerged from Christianity and other religions which gave us this freedom because we had to be ethically responsible for our actions. And we had to punish people who make free choices. But actually, if you look at very ancient stories, they don't seem to have free will. When people in ancient Greek myths, Odysseus does this, or he goes back and they fight the Trojan Wars. Everything that happens, people don't seem to be free to choose what happens. When another Greek myth, Oedipus's father tries to kill his son because he believes that there's a prediction that his son Oedipus was going to kill him, so he tries to kill him, but when he does this, he sends him off somewhere, and that means that he doesn't get killed, but when they meet at some point, Oedipus doesn't recognize his father, and Oedipus kills his father. So the prediction comes true, and this is a belief that people had in many ancient traditions of fate, that we aren't really all that free. Fate and destiny is actually a more ancient way of thinking about will. Yes, we have actions which we control, but they have antecedent causes. So that's the first thing I want to say about free will. Whatever it is, it's deterministic. Whatever thoughts we have are determined by earlier thoughts. But what we call our voluntary actions are distinct because we think about them, and they're caused by our conscious mind. And there are involuntary things we do, like me waving my hands when I'm talking, that are unconscious, and they're not part of our willed actions. They're just happening. And there are all sorts of things that we do. Blinking, for example, is non-conscious or unconscious. All the lips movements that I'm making to movement of my lips and tongue to speak, I don't have to think about those actions. So most of what the brain does comes on automatic pilot. And it's like what a robot does or a machine. And most of our actions are machine-like. But we have a subset of our actions that we think about. And the subset are influenced by our conscious mind, which is our brain's electromagnetic field. And that electromagnetic field will push and pull on neurons, persuading some to fire, some inhibiting firing of. And that is what we experience as what we call free will. That is our will. It isn't free, it's deterministic, but then I don't really think that anyone thinks their will is free. If you think of any action you do, you can find a cause for it in a previous, why you phone your brother, because maybe someone you saw on the TV reminded you of your brother, so you phone your brother. All of our actions have antecedents. So this idea of free will and the word free just confuses people. And we should drop free from will. Will is the action of the brain's electromagnetic field on the brain. That is what will is. It's not free, but it's will. Drives our voluntary actions.
So it's not free will in a libertarian free will sense, but it's volition in a sense that it is causally active.
Yes, exactly. It is causally active. There are some versions, ideas about consciousness, theories of consciousness, which claim that we have a conscious mind, but it doesn't do anything. That it has no causal influence. Another electromagnetic field theory of consciousness was put together by the neurophysiologist Susan Pocket, for example. She proposed that, yes, consciousness is our brain's electromagnetic field, but she didn't propose that it had any influence on brain function. So it's just left as something in our brain that is there but doesn't have any action. I can't really see that makes any sense, because the one thing we know about consciousness is that we are aware of it and we can talk about it. If our conscious mind was just like people say the steam whistle of a train, then why are we talking about it now? It will be locked inside our head and unable to influence any actions. But our conscious minds has launched thousands of books and thousands of websites and many millions of discussions around the world. Conscious minds have done that. So they must be causally active. If consciousness isn't causally active, then we'd be robots and we wouldn't be writing books about consciousness.
How does your theory explain metacognition or self-consciousness versus sentience or phenomenal consciousness?
Well, I suppose I haven't really thought about this much, but certainly one of the inputs into our brain and part of what becomes and thereby if it's an input into our brain, it will be part of the Cemi field, which is our conscious mind, is the activity of our brain. I mean, it's going to influence when we choose to do something, then that information we've chosen to do this will be part of the brain's electromagnetic field. So meta and a meta, and all the rest of it. We can have many, many layers. So a lot of what's in the brain's electromagnetic field will be information about how our body is working, how our mind is working. It will be memories of things that we have done. It will be ideas about things we might do. So there's all sorts of layers in the brain's electromagnetic field. So it can be as meta as you like, with lots of loops of information going through. Once you've generated a loop, you can send that loop around as many times as you like to generate as many layers of metacognition as you want.
What are your views on Bayesian brain model? It has been successful in explaining, for example, some mental disorders. And
yeah. I think it's very interesting, and I think it can be accounted for by bringing in another aspect of my thoughts at the moment. A new book is I've been writing and a new book will be published of mine called Life is Simple, which is about Occam's razor. Occam's razor is the principle of simplicity, that if there's a number of explanations for a phenomenon, choose the simplest. Bayesian reasoning incorporates Occam's razor, because the way that Bayesian reasoning works is it looks at probabilities and models and the way that it works. Probably too complicated to go into. But if you apply Bayesian reasoning, it automatically selects simple models.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the success of Bayesian models in reasoning in terms of analyzing how the brain works suggests that our brain is similarly doing that. It's also selecting the simplest hypotheses to, for example, account for our perceptions. When we see a shape, some shape of a line, a color, a texture, it can be many, many things. And what our brain seems to do is choose the simplest. I think that is happening mostly unconsciously. So it's probably our neurons who are doing that. Because what's delivered to our conscious mind is, say, when I was thinking of, well, you see a shape, you see a color, you see texture, it could be an apple, but it could be something else. It could be someone's face or whatever else. What enters our conscious mind is the apple, not all the other stuff. So I think this Bayesian reasoning is a mechanism that happens in the neuronal mechanisms, the synaptic neuronal transmission, synaptic transmission, and general neuronal computation that uses Bayesian reasoning. So I think it's a feature of the neuronal side of the brain rather than a semi field, because what seems to happen, what seems to enter our mind is an output, the simplest possible interpretation of our sensory data. That enters our conscious mind. So I think the Bayesian part is what goes on in neurons by neuronal computation mechanisms.
One last short question. Your Twitter account says you're authoritarian secularist.
Yes, it's a rather. It's what it means is, I think the most important. I guess it's coming from a perspective that reason is the best defense against all of the ills of society, and all of the ills of society, prejudice, racism, all of the beliefs like fascism, Nazism, and all what they're never reasoned. They're beliefs. And when people just have beliefs without reason, then they do unreasonable things. So I think the principal reason, or one of the principal reasons for why people, there's a saying, it goes something like, a good man can do good things, a bad man can do bad things, but only religion makes a good man do bad things. And that, I think, is why religion has to be kept out of causation. I'm fine with people believing in a God. I'm fine with people believing in all sorts, in 100 gods, in other gods. But I think when it comes to making policies, when it comes to working out how best to operate our world, to organize our world, faith should not come into the equation. Faith only causes confusion, a lack of reason, and the kind of disasters that have occurred. And faith, I think, is also, as well as religious, there's kind of faith in theories, and faith in beliefs like Nazism, like that there is a super race. All of these kind of things are not based on any reason. And when you try to reason them, you realize that they don't make any sense. But people don't care about that. They still believe in them. And I think we need to discard false belief, whether it comes from religion or it comes from authoritarian ideas like communism, Nazism, fascism, etc. We have to discard those and just use our reason to make sense of the world and to try to do the best we can to make the world a happier place for the people who live in it, and all the animals and plants and everything else that we share the world with.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I will let you know when I publish it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Zaza. Good to talk to you.
Goodbye.